y'all. How's everybody doing? Okay, so my name is, like he said, is Olufemi Esufu. I'm a senior business and administration major with a concentration in marketing. I'm originally from Benin, West Africa, but I grew up in Columbia, Maryland. And this summer, like he said, I got the opportunity to intern as a creative services intern at Ralph Lauren. I was actually blessed to have some of my brothers and sisters there with me this summer too. So if you guys are in the room, I'm gonna list out a couple of people if you could stand up. David Flowers, Tahaj Barrett, Camille Franklin, Zoe Huey, and also Winston Stewart. I'm sorry. Today we're joined by a special guest from Ralph Lauren. Ralph Lauren has been a brand that's undoubtedly played a big role in, I can say, me, my brothers and sisters' journey into the fashion industry. Today we have James Jeter here. James Jeter is a Morehouse man. He graduated class of 2013. One thing his classmates will say about him was his sense of style. That's one thing I find real important, having that sense of style within yourself. It's how you express your individuality through your creativity and whatever not as well. James actually started working in Ralph Lauren since he was young. He actually worked in the Polo Rugby store out in Georgetown in DC, where he's actually from. And he went from retail worker all the way up to concept designer. And I feel like that's just a testament of delayed gratification. I feel like us as black men, we're always looking for ways to achieve that success, like right away. If it doesn't happen by tomorrow, it's an issue and we give up. But this is a testament right here, someone who started off at 17 and then graduated, was able to spearhead this collaboration between Morehouse, Spelman, and Ralph Lauren, shedding light on HBCUs and showing that, there's more to our culture other than like media and entertainment as well. So without further ado, I'd like to bring out Mr. James Jeter.
Good morning.
James Jeter, good morning to you.
Good morning, sir.
How are you feeling?
Feel great. It feels really good to be home, and to be here in this on this stage with you in this function is one of the most important moments in my career. And I think under 10 years ago, I was sitting in those same seats as a student at Morehouse, for Crown Forum, and so it's just amazing to be back home.
Well, welcome. We're glad to have you here, especially on this, again, Be Our Brazeal Alumni Day Crown Forum, and we certainly want to make sure that we'll talk about kind of the lightning rod that is the polo campaign that you helmed and were the creative brain behind. But first of all, can you talk to us a little bit about the significance of Morehouse College for you, and what it kind of allowed you to do? What kind of battery in the back was there that the institution provided? Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
So just for a little context, my uncle actually went to Morehouse College. He was class of 1971, and he actually went on to become the American ambassador to Nigeria. He went on to Columbia grad school and UCLA, and to me, he always embodied this idea of a Morehouse man before I really understood what it was, before we defined it as a Renaissance man with a global conscious or a social conscious and a global perspective. Before we had these names attached to it, he embodied that for me, and it would end up becoming the only school that I would apply to. And what I learned at Morehouse, I think first and foremost, was the exposure to men of color across the spectrum, across the diaspora, in a way that I was not exposed to them prior. As Olu mentioned before, I'm from Washington, D.C., and there's something really magical about stepping onto a campus like Morehouse College that is very special. And I think in a lot of ways, you don't realize that until you leave. And in retrospect, you really see the true value that a school like this has. But I think while you're here, it really does put you through a crucible in that you really get to learn yourself in a way that you can't in any other environment. You have brothers around you that push you. There's obviously always going to be this competitive spirit that makes you better than you were before. And I think all of us, as we entered into Morehouse, we're told that we all were the best where we came from. And so when you arrive here, you're no longer that sort of the best student. You're among all the best students in the country. And there's something about being in an environment like that that pushes you past the limits and pushes you past where you initially thought you could arrive at.
So in being here and being pushed in those ways, was a through line that was significant for you, or I'm curious, to what extent was a through line significant, or the through line of being socially responsible and or having some type of social thrust that was going to be interwoven throughout your career overall, in terms of how it was that you grew as a person? Was that reinforced here, or?
Absolutely. I think one of the biggest underlying messages that I learned here was that you can't really change the world until you change yourself. And there were also moments like Crown Forum where you're exposed to individuals from all around the world. And there's something about that exposure, again, that sort of recalibrates how you view, value, how you view what your aim is once you leave the college. Less about, as an example, making money or this sort of selfish pursuit towards success, and more about how can you, sort of change the communities that you come from, and more broadly, how can you change the perception of your communities to the world. With whatever tools and platforms that you have as a vehicle to tell your own story and to push that conversation forward. And so again, I probably wouldn't be sitting on this stage today if my aim was sort of a personal, selfish, sort of monetary pursuit, and not one that was more socially oriented.
So talk to us a little bit, and I'm going to try and kind of integrate and synthesize the two, but your interest coming to Morehouse interests around fashion were with you before you came to Morehouse. Is that correct? Talk to us about why it is that that's important, and how it is that was a center for you in terms of how it is that you were going to work about the world.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, again, being from Washington, D.C., there was always a sense of style in the city. Everyone wore New Balance, and there were local brands like Sabiato, and I don't know how many folks in here are from DC, but being from there, I'm sure there's similar experiences in other cities as well. While I was in high school, I started working at the Georgetown rugby store when I was 16 years old, and I also went to a school for the arts in DC named Duke Ellington School of the Arts. And style was always an extension of creativity. My father was also a very stylish person, and so I think I inherited a little bit of that interest from him. And in the beginning, it was really this idea of having a blank canvas and being able to paint every day with clothing, in the beginning. And then I think it started becoming more of a tool as you sort of maneuver through the world to understand how clothing can be a useful tool in different scenarios. And so when I got to Morehouse, again, it was the first time I'd ever been in an environment where you walk onto a campus and you see hundreds of black men wearing suits. Just as an example, it actually blew my mind because, again, coming from DC, that's just something that you never saw. And it really, I think, opened up my perspective around clothing, around style. And while I was at Morehouse, I actually started a style guide within the Maroon Tiger to basically take all the things I learned while I was at Ralph Lauren to teach to the students at Morehouse.
So how do you negotiate that kind of style and this kind of presentation of, I guess, having it all together and being sophisticated or what have you, with the politics of respectability, right? So one of the pushes we know, and we've not fully got into the campaign yet, and we'll certainly get into that, and hopefully, I'm sure, have some good pushback in terms of questions. But one of the things that we have to consider is that You know, we talk about this in my Black Men, Black Boys Psychology and Modern Media class, where there exists this thing of exclusive exceptionalism. So this idea of, well, if you're suited and booted, then you're better than the rest of them. How is it that you negotiate the politics of that, being that obviously being a black man who's come out of Morehouse College, who's lived in DC, who has, you know, family, who is about the business of world politics and all that kind of stuff, and are able to be from the cut, right? How are you able to negotiate that? And I mean, what's your commentary on that? What do you say to folks who will say, but yeah, I mean, it's just being in suits and being in fine clothes. We can't even afford the polo stuff that's in the bookstore now and all that kind of stuff. What do you say to that? How do you deal with that?
Absolutely. I mean, look, I think it's all contextual, and you know, as we get into the campaign, I think it's important to sort of compartmentalize this idea of a period piece and sort of wearing suits and clothing as a tool versus one's own individual expression, and how they use clothing to express either wanting to wear a suit and that making them feel better, or wanting to wear a hoodie and still being validated within that. And you know, I don't think clothing should ever sort of give or take away value from anyone, whether it's something that's more casual like hoodies or sportswear, or it's something more tailored. I think it's really up to the individual to make that, you know, to derive that value for themselves. But again, I think it's all about the exposure. I think for me, as an example, as I mentioned before, you know, I grew up seeing my father wear suits, and so I have that personal connection to that. But before I came to Morehouse, I wasn't, you know, the most kind of well-dressed person in the world from a tailored clothing perspective. I wore the spectrum of clothing. As I mentioned, you would always find me in New Balance or hoodies or things that felt a little bit more casual. But you know, being in fashion as a job, I see clothing much differently than someone who may be in a different industry. I know finance and a lot of corporate spaces has been a really big conversation surrounding politics of respectability. And I think there's also been a very interesting history and evolution of that conversation. Because again, as you all know, the collection was really inspired by a time in the 1920s and 30s. And if you look at American style during that time, you know, everyone was really wearing suits. But what I think was beautiful about that moment is that the individuals at Morehouse College, at Spelman and other HBCUs weren't wearing suits to get validation from other communities. It was really just sort of, you know, validating themselves. And so we weren't wearing suits to, you know, again, feel better than anyone else. I think it was really just a moment to just feel good about ourselves.
So you said that being in fashion, you have a different perspective than perhaps the everyday person would. Can you talk to us about how it is? And then I do want to jump squarely into the campaign. We could talk forever, but I want to make sure we're mindful of time. Can you talk about how it is that, as you understand fashion, it is in any way related to freedom work?
Absolutely. I mean, again, I think that's also where that politics of respectability comes into place. But I think for me, fashion has been my tool because this is the industry that I'm in, and I think storytelling is so important. And so from my perspective, having the tools that I have, having the resources that I had working at Ralph Lauren, I was able to actually use clothing and style as a form of freedom work, I think, to really just expand and open the aperture around American style and ways in which a lot of American brands have helped to shape the idea of what the idealistic American person looks like. And clothing has been a big part of that. And so I think, again, it was really more about opening that aperture and evolving the conversation around aesthetic. You know, again, I think a lot of times when we look at media and we look at movies and things like that, people within this community tend to be pigeonholed into a certain aesthetic, into a certain box. But when we open up the albums of all of our family yearbooks and family photos, you know, you see your parents or individuals at, you know, balls and different events, And I just wasn't seeing that on the public stage. And so I just wanted to expose what I had learned and seen at Morehouse and basically reflect that out through this collection.
So let's scale up to the moment to where there was an interest and then, I guess, ultimately a green light for you to go ahead with the project that you kind of imagined and had perhaps been percolating in your mind for some years, right? Help me out, because I know everybody in terms of pre-work for this Crown Forum had the Washington Post article that seemed to be kind of the article of record in terms of you and how it is that you engaged in and with Ralph Lauren to get the collection out. You were at Morehouse College, you interned for Ralph Lauren. Help me out if I'm wrong here. Afterwards, you went to work with Ralph Lauren. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yes.
Okay. So you were there. Can you take us through your work at Ralph Lauren and then kind of a pivotal moment where it looked like you might leave? Can you kind of talk us through that?
Yeah, and again, just to give a little bit more context about the journey, it feels like every big step in my life, there was also a bit of a failure attached to it. And so even with Morehouse, I actually initially didn't get into Morehouse. I had to go through PSP and kind of fight for my life to get a chance to attend the school. And then the same thing would end up happening at Ralph Lauren. My sophomore year at Morehouse, everyone was getting an internship. And the only job I had ever worked for was Ralph Lauren. And so I figured that's where I probably had the best chances of getting approval. I applied, I get rejected. I moved to New York anyway, just to be closer to the offices and try to sort of network my way into the building. I would end up working in the store in New York. I met a designer. He gave me a chance. That's how I got my first internship at Ralph Lauren. And then the following summer, I would end up winning first place in the design competition at Ralph Lauren. And I think what that taught me was, hard work can always outwork talent when talent isn't working hard, because I was competing against students that went to the best design schools in the country and around the world. And I think that also piggybacks to a little bit about what Morehouse instills within you in terms of being able to be competitive in the world, because I think you carry with you this confidence that is very competitive to folks that may not also have that type of community like this place when you're dealing with corporate environments. And so, again, as I mentioned, I ended up winning first place in the design competition. I would then graduate. I worked in the store after graduating, after winning that competition. I figured, I would be a top designer after this, and that wasn't the case. Humbled very quickly. For a year, I worked on my days off in the corporate offices and basically worked for 7 days a week for about a year. And then I would end up joining the design team about nearly 10 years ago.
Okay. So you joined the design team, and then talk to us about, okay, you're in that design space, you're loving life, let's assume. And then the summer of reckoning comes about, right, with the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor. We're all locked down or compromised significantly because of COVID. White folk in general and white businesses in large part have this kind of mea culpa and realization that structural racism exists and are like, okay, we want to do better, right? Can you talk to us about how that kind of presented in the corporation that you're working for?
Sure. Yeah. So, sorry to kind of piggyback on your last question. Having been at Ralph Lauren since I was 16, which was in 2008, just for reference, I had been in design for about 8 or 9 years, and a lot of the stories were a lot of the same stories. It was very much centered around Ivy League schools, as an example, as we think about collegiate style. You would hear about Harvard and Princeton and Yale, and that would be the benchmark for how we would, sort of express to the world that this is what collegiate style looks like. There was never a mention of any of the schools that I, had seen growing up. There was never mention of any Morehouses or Spelmans or Howards. And at a certain point, it felt like there was never any hope for us to be a part of that larger conversation. And so the summer of 2020.
Let me pause you for a second. When you're talking about the stories, you're talking about as you all are designing the clothes, as you're creating a narrative that would be forward-facing for folks to see and to purchase. There were these ideas and these master narratives that suggested that the norm are these institutions and are these spaces.
Exactly. And I think that becomes very dangerous when you're dealing with a brand like a Ralph Lauren, who again has helped to shape the world view on American style. And so if you live in Japan, or if you live somewhere on the other side of the world, having never been to America, but you have seen these campaigns, then your perception of this place would be largely based on those images, on those stories, and none of those images or stories included our story.
Okay. And so what? So we have this summer of reckoning, right? And what's happening there? Is it that you're fed up? You're looking at kind of what's going on in the world, and you're like, dude, I gotta bounce. What?
Yeah. So we started. I think a lot of corporations around the world really started having these conversations about what now? What can we do? We started having these really kind of vulnerable, courageous conversations in a corporate environment. And I'm sure a lot of you have interned in corporate spaces. It can be very sort of corporate in that you don't really talk about politics. You don't really talk about race. Those things are meant to be left out of the office space, and you talk about that, in your personal time or with friends. We started having these conversations in boardrooms, in offices, in a way that in the course of my career had not happened prior. And so I ended up having a conversation with Ralph Lauren, and he basically asked me, how are you doing? What's going on in your world? How do you feel about all of this? And I told him that none of my heroes at the company looked like me. And what I meant by that was, when I think about all of the creative executives, all of the creative directors, all of the creatives in general at Ralph Lauren, none of them were people of color, or none of them were people that looked like me. And so, obviously I'm ambitious, I have ambitious goals, and one day I would love to sort of reach sort of the zenith at a brand like a Ralph Lauren, but it didn't feel like it was a possibility because there was no reference point for that. And so I told that to Ralph, and I figured, look, maybe this isn't the place for me. And he said, well, what would you like to do? Where do you see this going? And this collection would end up becoming the product of that conversation.
So how did that materially come about? So he said, okay, what ideas do you have? And were you like, oh, dude, I got all of them? I mean, what happened?
I mean, look, I think some of the best ideas that you find tend to be the ones that seem the most obvious, in a sense, like the seamless sort of ideas that you say, oh, well, why didn't that happen before? Or why doesn't this already exist? It's not until it happens that it seems so obvious. And, being at Morehouse, I pledged while I was here, and Henry Goodgame was my chapter advisor. And he would basically take us through these old Morehouse yearbooks from 1925, 1926, to essentially show and share some of our charter members for the fraternity. And he would take us through these yearbooks, and you would just see these incredible images of Morehouse students in the 20s and 30s, dressed like images that you would find on the walls at a Ralph Lauren, three-piece suits and tweeds and club ties and club collars, wingtip shoes, like the tailored sort of integrity of tailored clothing in that era. And I started showing Ralph those images, and he basically said I did not know that this existed. I had no idea. I think a lot of that had to do with there may have not been folks in a circle over the last 50 years that had an idea either, or that were a product of an HBCU, et cetera. And so it basically opened up a whole new world for Ralph, and he was extremely inspired and said, run with it, basically share this with the world, essentially.
So when it started out, were there just a couple of articles of clothing that you had? Did that scale up? And then also, there was a point, in full disclosure, I was associated with the campaign to the extent of the documentary. I was able to produce some of that content, so I was excited about that. Why were those kind of pairings, that and the yearbook as well, why were those pairings important to you besides the capsule collection? And can you tell us what a capsule collection is? Because I think, again, a lot of folks are like, dude, where is it? Because it's sold out immediately. I think it's available now online, and we have some stuff in the bookstore. And then also it's like, dude, this stuff is expensive as all hell. How are we supposed to afford this as college students? I mean, I do see it a lot on students, so obviously they're stacking some bags. But can you talk to us about what a capsule collection is, why it was important for you to contextualize the collection in the way that you did?
Sure. Yeah, so a capsule collection is essentially a limited edition collection that sits outside of a normal sort of fashion schedule. And so brands tend to design a fall collection, a spring collection that goes to market, and capsule collections can kind of live outside of that schedule, essentially. You also have flexibility in terms of how many SKUs, which are items of individual products, you're able to design within a particular capsule or collection. And regarding the yearbook and the documentary, look, if we're being honest, I think a brand like Ralph Lauren did not have sort of the credibility to tell a story like this, and so we couldn't really just put out the clothing, put out the images, and walk away. I think it was important to unpack some things. I think it was important to contextualize some things, and I think it was important to start with the story and not with the clothing. And so that's why, even within the documentary, it's not really about trying to sell clothing. Ralph Lauren as a brand really took a back seat, and I think what was so amazing about Dr. Rice producing that and being behind the camera and engaging in conversations with other faculty and students and alumni from Morehouse and Spelman was that it was really just giving a platform to the colleges to speak about the history of HBCUs and the significance of HBCUs. And so I think without that piece, this would be a very different conversation, and I think it also allowed the brand to fully commit and invest in truly telling the story, as opposed to just putting out clothing and without context, without, again, having that credibility from previous years.
So I want to ask if folks have questions, if they'd like to line up, we can take some questions in the proper programming of Crown Forum, and then we'll pause and dismiss and allow folks to ask questions further, because I think we might go over. There's a mic up here for folks who might have questions. But let me ask this. How successful was the collection? I mean, in terms of Ralph Lauren's expectations and things like that. What did it say?
It was extremely successful. I think mostly because of the exposure that it gave to the schools. I think the biggest success that it could have was being able to tell our story on the world stage in a different sort of way. And again, I went into fashion, so this is the tool that I had and wanted to use. But this type of exposure can happen across any industry with any tools that you have. It also obviously sold out very quickly in the first few weeks, and we sort of released a few of the pieces, which was great, because I think a lot of folks at the office who didn't know about these schools were kind of shooting in the dark. I don't think they really understood how much these schools mean to our community. And so it very quickly sold out online and in stores. And then again, the biggest success to me was it transcended fashion articles, and the stories and the reporters that were reporting on this collection wasn't just a place like WWG, which is a fashion magazine, or it wasn't just GQ or Vogue who also reported on it, but it was CNN, it was the Washington Post, it was news channels, CBS, et cetera, that were sort of reporting on this because they saw how important it was past just clothing and fashion.
And before we get to students, the quick question is, and that's it. So there's nothing else that's coming out. You're not doing anything else related to Morehouse College or HBCUs or anything. That's just, you're done.
Yeah, no, that was just the beginning. I think the goal is to normalize this type of storytelling so that it's not just a capsule. It's not just to say 2020 happened, let's scramble, do something, all right, and then wash our hands and walk away and get back to business as usual. I think the goal now is to integrate this into our normal storytelling, integrate this into our campaigns, and I think one of the biggest things was for the brand to give a young black designer from Morehouse College a chance to really lead this project from the beginning to the end. It wasn't really micromanaged. It wasn't I wasn't just kind of the outward-facing face, but internally there were other folks calling the shots. Ralph actually genuinely and truly allowed me to lead it, and we also partnered very closely with the schools as well throughout the entire project to execute this. And so, again, it wasn't just us in New York saying, oh, this is what it should look like, but we were constantly in conversation with faculty, alumni, students, to kind of co-create this together.
And Dean Carter, who was the archivist for the collection, one of the archivists, right?
Absolutely.
And
yes.
he's gonna let you kind of go wild in the archives, I think, as you go forward.
I hope so. That would be great. But I think today it's a lot of folks. One of my favorite images of all time is the image of all those students in the chapel, in the former chapel, in 1925, sitting in suits in Cell Hall, and you only get to see stuff like that. I'm sure there's so many more photos like that in the archive, but again, having access to that was such a valuable part of this collection, and being able to put out some of those archival images in conjunction with the images that we created, I think made it even more special.
And quickly, what was your position title before the campaign?
I think before the campaign, I was maybe a senior designer or a designer.
What's your position title now?
And I'm a senior director.
Word up.
Yep.
All right. First question, please. Try it one more time.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Kenner Grant, a sophomore in business administration, political science dual major from Albuquerque, New Mexico. And the question I have for you is, you've talked about failure during this conversation, and I wanted to ask, can you give an example in your career where you had to pivot or change your plans, and what did you learn from that situation?
Absolutely, a great question. So I was an English major while I was at Morehouse, and initially I thought I wanted to write for a magazine. I dabbled in philosophy for a little bit and tried to kind of refocus to English. And I think one of the biggest things is when I graduated, there wasn't actually an open position in concept design, and that's the team that I wanted to be on. But they did offer me a role in creative services. And I really had two options. And again, you're graduating from college, you're going out into the world, living by yourself in New York. I could either wait for something to open up and work in the store, which was a very humbling experience, or I could work in a corporate office but not be in the role or the team that I wanted to be on. And instead of, obviously it paid better, obviously there was something nice about being in corporate, obviously I would have a badge and all that good stuff, but I wouldn't be in the space that I wanted to be in. And so instead of taking that role, I opted to work in the store, and a year later I would end up being in the spot that I wanted to be in. Yeah.
Still don't work.
Judo's your freshman political science major by way of Washington, D.C.
Nice.
Got you. I can see that you're someone who understands the power of representation, and I was wondering if you would have a little more time after this to just stop and talk about some ways that I feel like you could help like our city necessary context I realize I'm not giving. I'm also from DC, and I went to school without walls, so I didn't really get that like chocolate city experience because I went to the charter schools and stuff like that. So I think we could talk a little more.
Absolutely, absolutely, we'd love to.
Appreciate you for taking my question. My name is Brazeal, junior kinesiology major, journalism minor, and I also serve as the secretary for the Maroon Tiger. You spoke on being from DC and also being a Duke Ellington graduate, right? The AUC has had and still has a significant number of really dope graduates from Duke Ellington. As a matter of fact, one of the contestants for Miss Spelman is a Duke Ellington graduate. So can you just shed a little bit of light on what you learned through that high school and what laid the foundation for your artistry?
Absolutely, yeah. So in my past life, I actually studied music while I was at Duke Ellington, and I was in a go-go band, for those of you from DC. Played timbales and congos, and I was running around the city. Morehouse saved me, let's just say that. And what was so beautiful about Duke Ellington was the ability to be creative every single day. At such a young age, I entered into Duke Ellington maybe when I was 14, 15 years old, and I was just around the most creative people in the world. My best friends were amazing painters and actors and poets and musicians, and I was in a jazz band, and it just, I think, worked a different part of my mind and brain that you don't necessarily get outside of being creative. Obviously, clothing was a big thing at Duke Ellington, and so it also, I think, helped to shape a little bit of my style sense. But the biggest thing was the ability to be on this creative exploration every single day. Late nights, I think class ended at 5:30 every day. You would have to get there at 7:30 a.m. for jazz band practice. And there was also, again, just the ability to constantly work on a craft and see yourself get better and just put in that work. And you can see, I think it really, in an early time in my life, showed me that what you put in is what you get out, and it materialized in a way that was actually tangible.
Thank you. This will be the last question in the program proper, but we'll continue after we sing the college hymn and close out, okay?
Good morning. My name is Tyler Henderson. I'm a sophomore psychology major in communication studies minor from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. I wanted to ask you, I know that Morehouse has a very specific culture around and tradition in professional styles of dress. Not saying that it's good or bad, but that obviously seems like to be a style that from a very young point in your life, you were very infatuated with, which is respectable. But I wanted you to talk about a little bit about how in creating this collection you had to professionally and personally engage or interact with respectability politics.
I think the thing that divorces the conversation a little bit away from respectability politics is the fact that it was really meant to be a period piece, and it wasn't to say whether, to your point, respectability politics was good or bad. I think it was really more aiming to provide a space to have the conversation. Why did men in the 1930s have to slick back their hair? And at Morehouse, where you were surrounded around everyone that looked like you, were you wearing three-piece suits to fit in, or were you wearing them to stand out? I think a lot of people also had personal style, and there were quirky ways that you could engage with clothing that wasn't about, arriving at your sort of value, but it was more about creative exploration. I'm sure you guys have this as well, but when we were at Morehouse on Thursdays, we would actually have to wear a suit every Thursday. There would be some days where, we would just be like, man, what are those socks you? It would be a little bit more of a funny kind of competitive dressing thing than it was a broader, I don't matter unless I wear these sorts of clothing. But I'm actually really excited about the current generation today, because I think the conversation around respectability politics has evolved more in the last 5 or 10 years than it has in on my lifetime or Dr. Rice's lifetime, and I think it'll only continue to move forward. A great example, 10 years ago, I probably wouldn't have on sneakers, neither would he. I mean, maybe you would have, I'm not sure. He has great style, but it wasn't necessarily proper, quote unquote, to have on sneakers with a suit. I think that will just continue to be the case. Then it'll become a t-shirt, then it'll become a blazer, and I only wore the suit today, just, it was less about fitting in or anything like that, but I remember when I was at Crown Forum, a lot of alumni showed me that same respect, so it was really just out of respect for the students as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
James Jeter, thank you so much for spending time with us today. Class of 2013.
Yes, sir.
You
Thank
do
you.
us proud. Thank you very much. We
Thank you.
appreciate you.
Thank you very much.
Dean Carter, do you want to join us for the singing of the college hymn? You don't have to. Olufemi, you want to come up? All right, can everybody stand up, please?